I used to believe the world was an orderly place, a system of inputs and outputs that could be understood, predicted, and if you were smart enough, mastered. For 15 years, this belief had been the bedrock of my life and my career. As a financial analyst, my job was to impose order on the chaos of the stock market, to find the patterns in the noise, and to build wealth slowly, methodically, brick by brick. And I was good at it. I wasn't a gambler, I was an architect. I built our life with the same careful precision I used to build a client's portfolio. Our house, a beautiful four-bedroom colonial at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, was our foundation. The manicured lawn, the two reliable cars in the garage, the laughter of our two children playing in the backyard, it was all part of the blueprint. We were the American dream, rendered in flesh and bone and mortgage payments. My wife was the heart of it all. She had given up her own career to raise our kids, creating a home that was a sanctuary of warmth and stability. She trusted me completely with our finances, a trust I took as a sacred duty. Every month, we would sit down at the kitchen table and go over our budget, our investments, our slow but steady progress towards an early retirement. Our portfolio was a testament to my philosophy: blue-chip stocks, diversified index funds, a healthy allocation of bonds. It was solid, sensible, and I'll admit a little boring. It was the financial equivalent of a Volvo, safe, reliable, and guaranteed to get you where you were going without any drama, and for years that was enough. We weren't chasing extravagant wealth, we were building a fortress of security. But then a new variable entered my carefully calculated equation: a company called Luminar. It was a tech startup on the verge of what everyone was calling a revolutionary breakthrough in AI-driven data processing. The buzz was deafening. Tech blogs wrote about it in breathless prose. Seasoned venture capitalists were calling it a generational opportunity. I watched it for months before its IPO, devouring every piece of data, every white paper, every interview with its charismatic young CEO. My professional skepticism warred with a growing, thrilling sense of certainty. This was different. This wasn't just another speculative play, this was the future. I ran the numbers, built the models, and the projections were astronomical. It felt like being a physicist in 1904 and reading Einstein's early papers. It was a paradigm shift. The orderly world I knew was about to be rewritten, and I had a chance to get in on the ground floor. The idea started as a whisper in the back of my mind. What if we took a real position? Not the small, cautious stake I would normally advise for a high-risk asset, but a life-changing one. The thought was intoxicating. It was the one move, the single, decisive play that could leapfrog us from comfortable to secure for generations. It wasn't just about a bigger house or fancier vacations. It was about true freedom. The freedom from ever having to worry about a market downturn, a medical bill, a college tuition. It was the ultimate form of risk management, a final, definitive victory. I brought it up to my wife one evening after the kids were in bed. I spread my charts and projections across the same kitchen table where we balanced our checkbook. I used the language of logic and reason, but my voice was thrumming with an evangelist's fervor. I pointed to the exponential growth curves, the market penetration models, the potential for a passive income stream that would make my salary irrelevant. She listened patiently, her brow furrowed with a familiar, gentle concern. She was the steady earth to my ambitious sky. "But it's everything," she said, her voice quiet. "You've always said never to put all our eggs in one basket." "This isn't a basket," I countered, my confidence soaring. "This is a freight train, and we have a chance to get on board before it leaves the station. This is different. I've never been more certain about anything in my life." I saw the doubt in her eyes, the deep-seated caution that was her nature. Our life was good. It was perfect. Why risk it? Why tempt fate? I understood her fear, but from my perspective, not making this investment was the bigger risk. It was the risk of mediocrity, of spending the next 30 years grinding it out when we had a chance to achieve escape velocity right now. In the end, she acquiesced, because she loved me, and because for 15 years, my judgment in this arena had been flawless. Her trust was my final green light. The next day, I started liquidating the blue-chip stocks we had held for over a decade, the index funds that had weathered 2 recessions, the bonds that were our safety net. I sold them all. Then I did something I had never done before, something I had always advised my clients against. I took out a substantial home equity line of credit, leveraging our most sacred asset, our home, and I put that into Luminar stock as well. The day the wire transfers went through, I felt a surge of adrenaline unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was a feeling of pure, unadulterated power. I had taken control of our destiny. For the first few weeks, I was a god. The stock didn't just climb, it soared. Every morning I would wake up and our net worth would have jumped by a figure that used to take me 6 months to earn. The numbers on the screen were a constant, thrilling validation of my genius. I was no longer just an analyst, I was a visionary. My wife's fears subsided, replaced by a sense of giddy excitement. We started looking at listings for bigger houses, browsing websites for luxury cars. The dream was no longer a distant goal, it was a tangible reality just a few months away. We were standing on the peak of the mountain, the view was breathtaking, and I had led us there myself. I had taken our perfect life, our carefully constructed fortress, and I had bet it all on a single roll of the dice, convinced that I couldn't possibly lose. The air was thin and cold at that altitude, but I was too high on my own success to notice that the storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The fall didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, sickening slide before the avalanche. It began with a news story, a small article buried on a financial news website. It was an investigative piece that raised questions about Luminar's core technology, suggesting that their claimed breakthrough was more marketing hype than reality. It quoted a few anonymous former engineers who spoke of faked DMOS and manipulated data. I dismissed it as FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the typical chatter from short sellers trying to drive down the price. I told my wife it was nothing, just the price of being a game changer. I even bought more stock on the dip, doubling down on my conviction, a move fueled by a dangerous mix of arrogance and pride. But then another story broke, this one harder to ignore. A prominent tech journalist published a detailed exposé, alleging that Luminar's charismatic CEO had a history of failed startups and questionable business practices. The stock, which had been a rocket ship, began to stutter. The beautiful, upward-sloping green line on my screen flickered and turned red. It was the first time our portfolio had lost value, and it felt like a personal insult. The confident swagger I'd had for weeks began to evaporate, replaced by a low-grade, persistent anxiety. I started checking the stock price obsessively, 10, 20, 50 times a day. It was the first thing I looked at when I woke up and the last thing I saw before I fell into a restless sleep. My phone became a vessel of torment. Every news alert, every market update sent a jolt of fear through my body. The conversations with my wife started to change. Her giddy excitement was gone, replaced by a quiet, gnawing worry that she tried to hide from me, but that I could see in the tightness around her eyes. "Are you sure it's okay?" she would ask, her voice thin. "Maybe we should sell just a little, just to get back our original investment." "No," I would insist, my voice sharper than I intended. "You don't sell in a panic. That's how amateurs lose money. We have to trust the fundamentals. The market is just having a moment of doubt. It will bounce back, stronger than ever." But I wasn't just trying to convince her. I was trying to convince myself. My entire professional identity was built on being the rational man, the one who didn't let emotion dictate his financial decisions. But I was neck-deep in emotion. My ego was so intertwined with this one investment that the thought of admitting I was wrong was simply unbearable. The avalanche was triggered by an official announcement from the SEC. They were launching a formal investigation into Luminar for securities fraud. The news hit the market like a detonator. In a single day, the stock plummeted 60%. I watched it happen in real time on my office monitor, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. The numbers on the screen were no longer abstract figures. They were years of our life, of our sacrifices, of our dreams, evaporating into thin air. The value of our life savings was cut in half, then by 2/3. The home equity line of credit we had taken out was now a gaping wound, an enormous debt secured against a collapsing asset. That night, I came home a broken man. The mask of confidence I had been wearing for weeks had shattered, and I had nothing left to hide behind. My wife took one look at my face and knew. She didn't have to ask. I couldn't speak. I just sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had so confidently sold her on this dream, and stared at the polished wood grain, tracing the patterns with my finger. She sat down across from me, the silence in the room a crushing weight. "How bad is it?" she finally whispered. I couldn't look at her. "It's all gone," I managed to say, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "Everything. The savings, the house money, it's all gone." The days that followed were a waking nightmare. The stock was halted, then delisted. The bankruptcy filing came a week later. Our investment, our entire net worth, was officially worth zero. The carefully built fortress had been razed to the ground. The first casualty was our peace. The quiet harmony of our home was replaced by a tense, brittle silence, punctuated by sudden, bitter arguments that would erupt out of nowhere. We fought about everything and nothing, a dish left in the sink, the volume on the TV, the way one of us looked at the other. But we were never fighting about the dishes or the TV. We were fighting about the monumental, unspoken catastrophe that was sitting in the middle of our lives. My failure, my catastrophic, life-altering mistake. "I trusted you," she screamed at me during one particularly vicious fight. "I worked for 15 years to build this life, to make this home, and you gambled it away on a pipe dream because you were too arrogant to listen." Her words were like bullets, and they all hit their mark because they were true. My arrogance, my pride, my need to be the hero had led us to ruin. The pressure from the outside world was just as relentless. My parents, who had been so proud of their successful son, were now full of pity and unsolicited, hindsight-fueled advice. Her parents were worse. Their disappointment was a palpable force. They were just worried about you conversations dripping with condemnation. The calls from the bank started. Cold, impersonal voices talking about default, about foreclosure. The life we had known was being systematically dismantled. We had to tell the kids we were moving. Trying to explain a concept like bankruptcy to a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old was an exercise in pure agony. They didn't understand the stock market or investments, but they understood the fear in our voices and the tears in their mother's eyes. They understood they were losing their home, their school, their friends. And they knew with the brutal, simple clarity of children that it was my fault. As I watched my wife pack our life into cardboard boxes, her movements stiff with a grief and anger she could no longer contain, I realized that I hadn't just lost our money. I was losing her. The foundation of our marriage, which I had thought was love and partnership, was now revealed to have been heavily buttressed by financial security and mutual success. With that gone, the cracks were showing everywhere, threatening to bring the whole structure crashing down on top of us. We were no longer a team. We were two people trapped in the wreckage of a shared life, each blaming the other for the disaster. The move was the physical manifestation of our fall from grace. We went from a 4-bedroom house in a community with top-rated schools to a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment on the top floor of a walk-up in a neighborhood we used to consciously drive around. The air in the stairwell always smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and damp concrete. Our beautiful, carefully chosen furniture didn't fit, both literally and figuratively. The oversized sectional sofa that was perfect for our old family room now consumed the entire living space, a monstrous, plush reminder of the life we no longer had. We sold most of it for pennies on the dollar to a consignment shop, a process that felt like selling off pieces of our own history. The apartment became our pressure cooker. There was no escape from each other, no separate rooms to retreat to after a fight. The kids had to share a bedroom for the first time in their lives, their bickering a constant, frayed-nerve soundtrack in the small space. My wife and I were orbiting each other like two hostile planets, the gravitational pull of our shared misery keeping us in the same tight space while the anger and resentment pushed us apart. Sleep became a battleground. We would lie in bed, side by side in the dark, the silence stretching between us, thick with unspoken accusations. Sometimes I would reach for her, a desperate, instinctual gesture seeking the comfort that had always been there, but she would flinch or pull away, her body rigid. The rejection was a fresh wound every single night. The person who had been my partner, my confidant, my soft place to land for 15 years, was now a stranger who looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. My career, the very thing that had defined my identity, was in ruins. I was still employed, but the respect I had once commanded was gone. The news of my personal financial implosion had spread through the office. I was a walking cautionary tale. The man who was supposed to be an expert on financial prudence had driven his own life off a cliff. My colleagues were polite but distant. I was quietly removed from key accounts. My advice, once sought after, was now second-guessed. I was a pariah, my confidence shattered. I would sit in my office, staring at market data, and see nothing but my own failure reflected in the numbers. The real strain, the one that threatened to break us completely, was the constant, grinding pressure of not having enough money. We had gone from a life of abundance to a life of scarcity overnight. Every purchase was a negotiation. Every bill was a source of anxiety. The budget was no longer a tool for planning our future. It was a weapon we used against each other. "You spent how much on groceries?" I'd ask, looking over the receipt, the unspoken accusation being, "You're not being careful enough." Well, if you hadn't lost every penny we ever saved, I wouldn't have to buy the cheapest cut of meat, she would retort, her words sharp and aimed to wound. The shame was a constant companion. We had to pull the kids from their private school, a decision that felt like a public declaration of our failure. At their new, overcrowded public school, they were outsiders, the kids from the rich neighborhood who had suddenly lost everything. We avoided old friends, dodging calls and making excuses to get out of social events. How could we face them? How could we pretend everything was normal when our world had been turned upside down? Their well-meaning sympathy felt like acid. I started to see the full weight of the burden my wife was carrying. She was the one who had to face the judgment in the grocery store line when an item was declined. She was the one who had to tell the kids they couldn't have new shoes or go on the school field trip. She was the one who was trying, with dwindling resources and a broken heart, to hold the fragile remnants of our family life together, while I retreated further and further into a shell of guilt and depression. One evening, I came home from work to find her sitting at the small, wobbly kitchen table, surrounded by a pile of bills. She was crying, not loudly, but with the silent, exhausted tears of someone who has simply run out of strength. I stood in the doorway, a familiar wave of defensiveness and guilt washing over me. I braced myself for another fight, but instead she looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy, and said something that broke through my defenses. "I can't do this alone anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't be the only one holding this together. I'm angry at you, yes, I am so angry, but I am also scared, and I miss my husband, I miss my partner." In that moment, something shifted. For the first time in months, I didn't see her as my accuser. I saw her as my wife, the woman I loved, who was drowning right in front of me. And I realized that in my own self-pity and my own shame, I had left her to drown alone. I walked over and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in mine. They felt cold. "I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling utterly inadequate but desperately sincere. "You're right, I haven't been here. I've been so lost in what I've lost that I forgot what I still have. I forgot that I still have you." It wasn't a magic solution. The bills on the table didn't disappear. The anger and the hurt didn't vanish. But it was the first crack of light in a long, dark tunnel. It was the first time we had stopped blaming each other and acknowledged that we were in this wreckage together. We sat there for a long time, not talking, just holding hands in our tiny, cramped kitchen, the pile of bills a testament to our brokenness, but our clasped hands a small, fragile promise of a new beginning. That night in the kitchen wasn't a finish line. It was a starting line. The decision to stop fighting each other and start fighting our circumstances together was a conscious, daily choice. It was the hardest work we had ever done. We began with a brutal, honest conversation. We laid all the ugliness on the table, my guilt and shame, her anger and resentment, our shared fear for the future. We allowed each other to be angry without judgment. For the first time, I stopped making excuses and just listened to the depths of her pain, the pain I had caused. And she, in turn, listened as I talked about the crushing weight of my failure, not as a way to absolve myself, but to let her see the man who was buried underneath it. The first practical step we took was to declare bankruptcy. The word itself felt like a brand of failure, a public admission of defeat. But our lawyer explained it as a tool, a way to stop the bleeding and get a fresh start. The process was humiliating. We had to itemize every asset, every debt, our entire financial life laid bare for strangers to scrutinize. But with each paper we signed, I felt a strange sense of release. We were letting go of the past, formally and legally. We were amputating the gangrenous limb of our debt to save the rest of our lives. We had to build a new life from the ground up, and that started with a new budget. This time, we built it together. We sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and a calculator, and for the first time, my wife was not a passive observer but an active partner. It turned out she was incredibly resourceful, with a knack for finding deals and cutting costs that I, in my high-flying financial world, had never appreciated. We approached it like a team tackling a problem. We called it the plan. It was our roadmap back to solvency, and every small victory, a bill paid on time, a few extra dollars saved, was a shared triumph. To make ends meet, my wife, who had been out of the workforce for more than a decade, decided to get a job. She updated her old resume and took a position as a part-time administrative assistant at a local doctor's office. The pay was modest, but it was hers. I saw a spark of her old self come back, a sense of pride and independence I hadn't seen in years. She was contributing not just as a homemaker, but as a provider. Our roles had shifted. I was no longer the sole, infallible financial captain. We were co-pilots, navigating the storm together. This shift had a profound effect on our relationship. We started talking again, not just about bills and problems, but about our days, our hopes, our fears. I would come home from my own humbling job, and we would cook dinner together in our tiny kitchen, coordinating our movements in the small space, a clumsy but intimate dance. We found joy in things that cost nothing. We took the kids to the public library instead of the bookstore. We had picnics in the park instead of dinners in restaurants. We would spend Friday nights all piled on our old, oversized sofa, watching a movie, the closeness of our small apartment forcing a physical and emotional intimacy we had lost in the vastness of our big house. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of profound sadness for the life we had lost. We would see old friends post pictures of their European vacations on social media, and it would sting. But the bitterness began to fade, replaced by a quiet appreciation for what we had. Our children, who we had feared would be scarred by the experience, proved to be more resilient than we could have imagined. They adapted, they made new friends, and they saw their parents working together, united. They had less stuff, but they had more of us. They had a family that was healing. About a year after we moved, we finally hit a small milestone in the plan. We had saved enough money to take a weekend trip, not to some exotic resort, but to a simple campsite by a lake a few hours away. We packed a tent, a cooler full of hot dogs and marshmallows, and our two excited kids into our old, paid-off car. That Saturday night, after a day of swimming and hiking, we sat around a crackling campfire. The kids were trying to roast the perfect marshmallow, their faces glowing in the firelight. My wife leaned her head on my shoulder, and we looked up at the vast, star-filled sky. We didn't have a big house or fancy cars or a multi-million-dollar stock portfolio. We had a mountain of debt that we were slowly, painstakingly chipping away at. We had a life that was infinitely smaller and harder than the one we'd had before. But as I sat there, with the warmth of the fire on my face and the weight of my wife's head on my shoulder, surrounded by the sounds of my children's laughter, I felt a sense of profound, unshakable wealth. We had lost everything we thought was important, everything we had worked for. But in the ashes of that perfect life, we had found something far more valuable. We had found each other again. Our marriage wasn't our biggest liability, it was our most valuable asset. And it was an investment that was finally, truly paying off. That's the end of today's story, but now I'm curious, what country are you watching from? Write it in the comments and let's see how international we really is. Hit that like button and subscribe for more unforgettable stories.